So we're still talking about musculature. We have a little bit to finish up about it. And we'll get to that in a second. I want to, what did I want to say? Well, first off, I remind you that class is canceled for Thursday. I won't be here. I haven't put the presentation material up for the musculature yet. I had kind of hoped that I'd get a lot of that done last night or this morning, and I'm going to be in Boston for the rest of the week, so I wanted to try something out, which was to try to use my phone for recordings. And so I didn't bring my microphone home to make recordings last night, and I tried it with my phone, and it completely didn't work. So I really kind of wasted last night. I could have gotten a lot of recordings done. But so I'm a little behind on the musculature stuff, getting that posted. And I also need to get around to starting to post the stuff for the nervous system. But of course, that doesn't really matter for you guys because I've been covering all that stuff in class. Really, the stuff that's going to be the presentations is exactly what I've been covering for the past couple of weeks in class. So I want to finish out the musculature stuff. And in getting stuff ready for recordings, I've broken the whole thing down into separate presentations with subtitles. So this one is the energy and contraction. Okay, I didn't realize this. There we go. It cuts off the thing at the bottom. So this is about energy and muscle contraction, which we started last time. And I actually added a little bit into it, the stuff that I wrote on the board last time. Oh, shoot. Hold on a second. I have not, however, cut these down to just the slides that are in each one. So I did add to this what I wrote in the board last time, the reaction for cellular respiration, which putting it in here like this means that I don't get to sort of do a little spiel about how to balance the equation, because I had to put that all in there. But just to remind you, this is where we were. This is what I ended on last time, right? I didn't get to talk about it in the pictures. Okay, so
Yeah, we had just gone through the resting muscles and all that.
we had started looking at these?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, okay, yeah, I talked about, did I go through all these? So I did this one, just showing that the energy in ATP gets sort of transferred over to creatine to make creatine phosphate when the muscle's at rest, and then when it's active, that energy gets transferred back by the enzyme called creatine kinase, so that there's energy available for muscle contraction. And I used the Oreo cookie example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is like hiding the Oreos so that you don't eat them, except when you really, really need them. Do we look at this? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
It's all sort of slowly coming back to me. And I do want to make the point, I probably did last time too, what goes into the mitochondria to make a bunch of ATP. In the book here, they have blood glucose, pyruvic acid, and fatty acids. To start with glucose and go on to what happens in the mitochondrion means that we have to break that glucose down. And when you break the glucose down, you make pyruvic acid. So really these two things, this arrow should be pointing at the pyruvic acid, and that goes in. Alternately, especially when the cell has plenty, we were already up to the table looking at, talking about fatigue and stuff like that, right? Okay, well, I'm here, let me just kind of remind you of these things. Fatty acids get broken down to feed into the cycle when they're available. Pyruvic acid has a 3-carbon structure to it. And one of those carbons gets removed and comes off as carbon dioxide. And then the 2-carbon structure left over goes into the Krebs cycle to make all that ATP. With fatty acids are chains of carbons, however long they happen to be, and basically feeding the mitochondrion, a couple of carbons are broken off and that's fed into the Krebs cycle, and then another couple are broken off and they're fed in, and then another couple are broken off. And so fatty acids just provide a bunch of carbon-based structures that feed into the Krebs cycle, and that's where we get all the energy to eventually make ATP. If you look on a nutrition label, you'll see that carbohydrates and proteins do not have as many calories in them as fatty acids, and this is basically why. The pyruvate molecule that we're talking about that gives us, that feeds into the Krebs cycle is half of a glucose molecule. So you can do this twice with glucose to feed into the cycle and make ATP. With a fatty acid, you can keep breaking it down, keep pulling double carbon structures out of it, and keep feeding into the Krebs cycle. So for 1 gram of carbohydrates, if I remember correctly, there's 4 calories worth of energy, and technically that's a kilocalorie, which is usually glossed over in nutrition labels. They just call them calories, but they're really kilocalories. And the same amount of fat, 1 gram, will yield 9 kilocalories worth of energy. So there's just more energy in lipids, fats, per gram than there are in carbohydrates. And proteins are about the same. Now, it doesn't mention it here because this is referring to what happens during moderate activity, but you can, if you don't have carbohydrates or lipids as a source of energy, you can feed the Krebs cycle and the mitochondrion with protein. And what's the individual unit of a protein? What are proteins made up of?
Amino acids.
Right. And amino acid has this basic structure on it. And so you can take off the amino group and remove some other things off of it, and you get a 2-carbon thing that can be in the Krebs cycle. So any of those nutrient molecules, they have caloric content to them because we can use them to make ATP. Using amino acids, however, can be problematic, especially if we're talking about muscle contraction. What are muscles mostly made of?
Protein.
Protein. Okay. So if you're going to if you're going to break down, metabolize amino acids to make ATP for muscle contraction, you're basically, it'd be like burning the wood that makes up the frame of your house to stay warm, okay? The frame of your house keeps you warm by keeping the cold air out. But if you start breaking it down to burn it to make a fire, it's cutting off your nose to spite your face, is the old saying. So it's not a great way to go. So primarily when muscles are making ATP, they'll stick to carbohydrates and fatty acids. It is possible under extreme conditions when those 2 things aren't available, if you are not taking in any food, if you've burned off all of your fat reserves and you're in sort of a starvation mode, then muscles will start to break down proteins and use amino acids to feed into making ATP at the expense of the muscles that are in your body. Now, this can be very problematic because if you start eating your own muscles, essentially, you're going to eventually decide to start breaking down the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is necessary for you to breathe. Okay? And if you don't have the muscle to pull air into your lungs, you're not going to get oxygen to the various organs that need it, and it'll be fatal. So it's not a great way to go to use amino acids to feed that. People that are trying to lose weight will eat, say, a low-carb diet, and their intent is to get rid of fat stores. If you're on a low-carb diet, what is high in that diet? Get two other choices. Protein, right. So if you're on the Atkins diet or the South Beach diet or whatever, you eat a lot of protein. Okay. That way you have in your system available for use amino acids, and you won't catabolize your own muscles to do it. Okay. So the different nutrition molecules kind of feed into this. And then I mentioned when oxygen's not present and therefore the mitochondria can't do their job, then you can get energy from anaerobic respiration, oxygen-free respiration, which sounds like an oxymoron. Oxygen-free breathing, kind of what it sounds like it means. But what it really means is breaking down glucose as much as you can before the oxygen is required, and you get a little bit of energy out of that. When oxygen's not present, the pyruvate, which is another name for pyruvic acid, ends up becoming lactic acid. When the oxygen's present, then the pyruvate goes on into the mitochondrion to make more ATP. But at least with glycolysis, you can get a little bit of ATP out of breaking down sugar. So we were at this point, and actually, now that I'm looking at this, I got to remember to make my own version of this table. So I was describing the different types of fibers, and I talked about the speed that they contract at, which is time to peak tension, or contraction speed. And I described fatigue resistance, right? I think that's as far as I got. Just because it's on the table here at the top, I want to deal with this, and I'll show you a picture to deal with this in a while, but the cross-sectional diameter of these fibers corresponds to which class it is. Slow fibers tend to be very small, thin fibers. Fast fibers tend to be thick fibers. And it's just a matter of how much protein they have in them making up the myofibrils. So fast fibers are going to have lots of myofibrils in them, and therefore they'll be very thick fibers. Other things to consider about what they look like has to do with the next few things here. Color-wise, the fibers, slow fibers tend to have a reddish appearance. Fast fibers tend to have a whitish appearance, and then the intermediate fibers are going to be in between. The reason for that is because of two things, which is the myoglobin content in the fiber and the capillary supply to it. Now, what does capillary supply mean? What's that supplying to the muscle?
Blood.
Blood, right. And what does blood have in it? It's important for these muscles.
Oxygen.
Oxygen, right. Fast fibers don't really use oxidative methods. They don't use the aerobic respiration in the mitochondrion so much. So they don't need a lot of capillaries, which is going to be maybe kind of scarce. Now, when there's oxygen in blood, what color is blood? Red. And so with fewer capillaries and a lower blood supply to the muscle, the fibers are going to have a paler appearance to them. Now, I just asked you, when oxygen is present in the blood, what color is it? Why is blood red when there's oxygen in it?
Because the iron in the blood oxidizes.
What does it oxidize? stuff. What did you start to say?
Hemoglobin. That's basically.
So it's technically not the hemoglobin, but it's important because of the hemoglobin. What does hemoglobin have in it that oxygen reacts with?
Heme.
Okay, we're halfway there. Yes, hemoglobin has in it a thing called heme, which is a molecule that holds on to the thing that oxygen actually oxidizes. What's in the middle of the heme thing? What do people often have to, especially women, get as a supplement to help them? Iron, right?
I said that.
I didn't hear you say that. You gotta say it loud enough for me to hear it to get credit. But yeah, so when oxygen and iron react, they make a red color. Okay, and that's why blood's red. That color is basically rust. I mean, iron oxide is rust. And iron oxide is what you have within the hemoglobin. Heme. So capillaries are scarce, and therefore the fast fibers are pale because they don't have that oxidized blood moving through and around them, making darker. But also, the fiber itself is fairly pale for a very similar reason, which is myoglobin. Okay, so we just established that in blood we have hemoglobin that helps carry the oxygen. In muscles, there's a related molecule called myoglobin. So hemo means blood, myo means muscle, and globin is just describing the shape of the protein. But they both work on the same principle, that they have in them an iron ion that oxidizes and holds on to the oxygen so that it's available when it's needed. Fast fibers are really white themselves because they have a very low myoglobin content, because they don't need oxygen so much. The slow fibers are red because they have a lot of capillaries going around them through that part of the muscle, and they have a high myoglobin content, so they have a lot of oxygen on hand to drive that aerobic respiration stuff happening in the mitochondria. And then intermediate fibers are kind of in the middle there. They have an intermediate amount of blood supply, but they have fairly low myoglobin content, so they kind of are pinkish in color. And then sort of going with the availability of oxygen, whether it's coming from the blood or from myoglobin storage in the cell itself, mitochondria go with this. So slow fibers have lots of mitochondria, fast fibers have very few of them, and intermediate fibers are intermediate. The fast fibers don't really use aerobic respiration. They have some mitochondria under completely restful conditions. If they're not contracting at all, they might build up a little bit of an ATP reserve from the mitochondria they have. But slow fibers have so many more mitochondria, they're always making ATP. And last time I was describing them as fatigue resistant, and a lot of that's because they build up so much ATP and they use it so slowly compared to the other fibers that they never really get to the point where they're fatigued. Okay. So mitochondria, the presence of mitochondria gets at if they have oxidative processes producing ATP. Then the next column or row here says glycolytic enzyme concentration in sarcoplasm, which is getting at the enzymes that handle the anaerobic side of things. Now, mitochondria need glucose to be broken down so that there's pyruvic acid to feed into the mitochondria. So there needs to be some in the slow fibers, but there's a lot more in fast fibers because fast fibers rely on glycolysis to make most of the ATP that they're going to have and use, which they'll use up fairly quickly. Sort of reinforcing what I've said here, slow fibers will use lipids, carbohydrates, and amino acids if need be to power ATP production, whereas the fast fibers, whether they're the intermediate or the full-blown fast fibers, will use carbohydrates. The intermediate fibers that kind of hedge the bets as primarily carbohydrates as opposed to strictly carbohydrates in the fast fibers, because intermediate fibers can make ATP the same way that slow fibers do, using lipids or amino acids if necessary. At the bottom here, they have alternate names for these fibers. I don't care that you know a whole bunch of them. They're referred to as type this, type that, whatever. The one thing I want to point out is slow fibers are often referred to as slow oxidative fibers. So slow about how they contract, and then oxidative is to just reinforce that they use mitochondria to make lots of ATP. And then the fast fibers, sort of in mirroring the slow oxidative, are sometimes called fast glycolytic. And in the table here, they don't quite, well, they say fast twitch glycolytic, but they don't show an abbreviation for that. SO for slow oxidative, FG for fast glycolytic, or fast twitch glycolytic, should be there. The FF for fast fatigue, I don't see that kind of representation of it too often. And then in the middle here for the intermediate, I'm actually kind of surprised that they don't have this designation. They do say fast twitch oxidative, which kind of gets it that they're fast fibers, but they're oxidative like the slow fibers. But really what I hear more often is fast oxidative glycolytic, meaning that it can use oxidative or glycolytic means to make ATP. And the reason why you hear that probably most is the abbreviation is FOG. So you'll see fog fibers. Not that they're referred to as fog fibers, but you'll see FOG sometimes as an abbreviation for them. Okay. And again, that's just putting together the speed of contraction and how they make their various, make ATP in their various ways. Now, I wanted to show you a picture, which I haven't put into the presentation yet, but you have access to it in the first week's muscle stuff. And I was showing you this, oh, that's joints. I was showing you this in lab, which now is quite a ways back, but we were looking at the types of muscle tissue, and I was showing you these figures. This is, actually, let me start with this one. This is a 10x objective view of a skeletal muscle fiber, or sorry, skeletal muscle, and we can see the individual fibers in cross-section here. Let me move to the 40x objective, which is going to zoom in this area right here on the picture. Oh, I guess I went the wrong way. Oh, okay, there it is. So these are individual muscle fibers. These couple here got kind of separated away from each other as the tissue dehydrated, but we can see some kind of all stuck together, but we can make out individual ones. This one's staining very darkly, as is this one next to it. This one's staining fairly lightly. I don't know exactly what the staining corresponds to perfectly, but the darker staining fibers that we see in this field of view are also some of the thinner fibers. So whatever it's staining for is obviously associated with the thinner, slow fibers. It might be, and this is just a general cell stain, but it might be reacting with higher levels of myoglobin or something like that in the cell. I don't know what's actually causing them to stain darker. And then when we get to bigger fibers, like this fiber here, this fiber here, or this fiber here, they tend to be lighter in staining, as they have less of whatever the stain's reacting with. Again, it might be myoglobin, I'm not positive. And then there are some intermediate sized fibers, like this one here maybe, or this one, that or this one, that are in between in the staining intensity. Okay, sort of showing that we can stain for fibers and actually see them separately. The point I want to make here is that these fibers are all together in muscles, intermingled. They're going to belong to different motor units, but those motor units will be all together to make the different muscles that we have. There will be more of certain types of muscle fibers in one muscle versus another. And to explain that idea, I want to take advantage of the fact that this is A&P 1 being taught in the fall semester. When I have to explain this in other semesters, I have to say, okay, pretend that we're in the fall semester and it's mid-November. What are most students thinking fondly about coming up in the very near future?
Break. Thanksgiving.
Fondly. Thanksgiving.
Oh, fondly?
Yeah, they're looking forward to that long weekend. Of course, you guys have a long weekend coming up now because everything's in class. But at this time of year, we have Thanksgiving coming up soon. What will you be doing over Thanksgiving?
Eating.
What are you going to be eating?
Turkey.
Turkey. What type of turkey do you prefer to eat?
Dark. A golden one.
What do you mean by dark,
Dark meat.
as opposed to,
White.
and what are those two types of meat, actually?
Thigh meat.
So you find one type in the thigh.
Yeah.
Which type will be in the thigh?
The dark meat.
Okay.
The breast are white.
Breast are white. Now, in fowl, in birds, the fibers that we're talking about are actually separated out a bit much. So white meat is actually muscles made up predominantly of fast fibers. It's white meat because they're white fibers. They have low myoglobin content, and there's less blood supply to those fibers. And then dark meat is predominantly oxidative fibers. Might be slow, might be intermediate. And it's darker looking cells because they have myoglobin in them. And if you've eaten a drumstick, you've probably noticed that there's lots of little blood vessels running through that too. Okay. So you can see that very clearly there, looking at breast meat versus leg meat. Okay. Now, what does the bird actually use those muscles for?
Standing.
Which ones are you using for standing?
Or legs. Leg muscles.
So the dark meat are primarily used for standing posture. What about the white meat? What's it used for?
Does it help with the wings?
Right. It's the pectoralis muscle. Okay. So for us, it's the muscle that attaches to the arms and makes it possible to move it this way. Okay. And so for a turkey, it's to flap the wings. Do turkeys fly?
No.
Okay. I live in an area where wild turkeys are somewhat common. And in the winter months, my wife likes to put out bird feeders for the little birdies when snow is covering the ground. And we often get wild turkeys saying, hey, look, free food. It's a very scary morning when you get up and you look out the window and there's this huge dinosaur sitting right there on your deck, yeah. This past year, however, apparently since we were giving free food to the local wild turkeys, one of them really, really liked us. And I had this really bizarre morning. I looked out onto the backyard, which of course was covered with snow, and there was a turkey out there acting really weird. And I stepped outside and looked out the window, and I realized the reason he was acting so weird is because there was a bobcat in our yard. So I think the turkey was sort of saying, hey, there's something weird in your yard, I just want you to know. When the bobcat saw me, he was like, what the heck are you doing here? I'm just hanging out, leave me alone. But then I wanted to chase it off because I didn't want the bobcat getting used to hanging out in our yard. And as soon as I did, the turkey said, well, my job is done. And it took off and it flew. I had no idea that turkeys could fly like that. It was majestic. It just took off and it flew over the woods. It probably landed in the top of one of those trees, but it's more than I would have thought that any turkey could do. But those are wild turkeys. You're probably eating a Purdue turkey or a butterball turkey or whatever at Thanksgiving. And they certainly don't fly. They're bred to have moist, tender white meat, which is they can't fly. They have feathers clipped or whatever, and they're not able to get any lift, and so they can't really use them. But for that wild turkey I just mentioned, it just jumped up and flew a little ways and then it landed. And that's about all that kind of bird's going to do. Now, there are certainly birds that fly quite a bit more than that. But for a turkey or something like that, it's only going to fly in short bursts, if they even fly. But the dark meat in the legs are there because they're always going to be standing, well, not always, but they're mostly going to be standing or walking around or moving or whatever. So that gets at the fatigue thing. The white meat, the fast fibers, fatigue very quickly and are only used in very short bursts. Whereas the fibers in the darker meat can sustain contraction for longer. So those birds can stand and hunt for food on the ground or run away from something or whatever it might be pretty easily. And we find a predominance of certain fiber types in muscles associated with those kind of movements. For postural muscles, we have more slow fibers. For muscles that we use for something like a quick sprint, we're going to have more fast fibers. And then for muscles that we use for sustained contractions, but that we can tire out from, like light running or walking, we're going to see more intermediate fibers. A good example of this is your calf. In your calf, you have two major muscles. The superficial one is called the gastrocnemius, and the deep one is called the soleus. They both attach from the proximal posterior tibia to the calcaneus. They together make up the calcanean tendon or Achilles tendon. And when either of them contracts, it causes plantar flexion, okay, which for walking is necessary to push off from the ball of your foot. So they're involved in that, but also just in standing still, you need to keep a little pressure pushing down on the balls of your feet so that you don't just fall forward. Okay. The gastrocnemius is more important for walking, and the soleus is more important for posture. The soleus can maintain contraction for a long time. It's a fatigue-resistant muscle, so that you don't fall over. Whereas the gastrocnemius is potentially can fatigue quicker, like if you're walking up the stairs or something like that, because it's more fast fibers, more likely to be fast oxidative fibers, but still fast as opposed to slow fibers. So you can sort of see that within the muscles. If we could look at them like this, we'd see more small fibers in the soleus and more, not exactly large fibers, but maybe the intermediate size fibers in the gastrocnemius. That wraps up the explanation of muscle fiber types. It seems like there's one other thing I'm going to say about that, though.
Cardiac muscle.
Well, we're just concentrating on skeletal muscle, but it does bring up an interesting thing to mention, which is cardiac muscle doesn't really fatigue. If your cardiac muscle fatigued, then your heart would say, I gotta rest for a little bit. And you definitely don't want your heart to rest. So the cardiac muscle will continuously contract. And if it doesn't contract for too long, then you're not going to survive. Part of how cardiac muscle does that is that it's highly oxidative. There's lots of mitochondria in cardiac muscle making a bunch of ATP, and it's also all slow fibers. Okay. Actually, there's two types of fibers. There are four chambers of the heart: the atria and the ventricles. Atrial fibers are more like intermediate fibers, and ventricular fibers are more like slow fibers. But they have another aspect to them, which we'll talk about next semester, that makes them contract for a very long time, very slowly. But also, if you've ever seen a depiction of the heart, it has what look like little fat pockets all over it. And that's not because somebody has heart disease and there's fat accumulating on their heart. That's just a little reserve of adipose tissue so that they have fatty acids available to break down to feed into the mitochondria when necessary. So, yeah, I wouldn't have normally mentioned cardiac muscle, but since we're talking about fatigue, it's worthwhile mentioning that there. So, okay, so that ends the muscle aspect of what I want to talk about. So let me just